men who were once fighting for this land now control it. And they're enforcing the diktat of their leader. This is a Taliban anti-narcotics unit. Deep in eastern Afghanistan, they stop when they see a field of poppy. While the men raise it, their commander shouts at the family that owns the land. "I told you to destroy it yourselves." Hidden from view, a woman screams back in anger, but then retreats indoors. Within minutes, it's all gone. The poppy that this family spent months growing.
Hello, my name is Dumesnil-Fernandez.
Hi, I'm Kai Tazawa. Today we are going to discuss the cash crop, poppy seed, in Afghanistan. The opium poppy is a particular poppy seed, or Poppies somniferum, that produces opium, a powerful narcotic whose derivatives include morphine, codeine, heroin, and oxycodone.
Afghanistan is a fascinating country. We will explore the problematic environmental questions associated with the complex international foreign relations, which significantly affect the Afghan people. We have titled this podcast Opium Poppies. Are they inevitable to the future of Afghanistan? To give you a little background, I want to discuss Afghanistan's history and explain its place in the contemporary world. Since the 28th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP28, they've been pushing for a more decisive climate action with a 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. There have been breakthrough agreements on new loss and damage funds for vulnerable countries that have been hit. Interestingly enough, it's essential to recognize that Afghanistan is one of the most vulnerable to climate change and one of the lowest emitters of greenhouse gases. Afghanistan was not represented at COP27 or COP28. It was represented in COP29. Still, it was not a proper invitation. The reason is the UN does not recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government after seizing Kabul in August 2021. Global cultivation of opium started in the 1960s and 70s. In 1973, the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, had a rigorous anti-narcotics unit. However, it was minimal in terms of international criminal charges. Poppy was not being sold at the level it became recognized for.
Right. I think I remember from Flowers of War, wholesale opium smuggling wasn't as big as it was back then. Small niche communities only really came to buy it like hippies. Now it's popular and in demand globally, giving Afghanistan a way out of poverty. Production didn't increase until the 1980s, though. From Mansfield's Journal of Illicit Economies, the cultivation of opium surged when warlords built patronage networks by taxing cultivation and inserting themselves in the trade.
Yeah, it only became a legitimate enterprise in the mid-1980s. I found this interesting during the war in the 1980s. The Americans supported Mujahideen, a loose alliance fighting against the Soviet-backed regime in Afghanistan, would have inevitably become the Taliban themselves. They would use opium as a source to fund their party. They would deny such claims even to this day. The proxy war between Russia and the USA would be a breeding ground for opium. The Mujahideen forcibly used farmers to harvest and plant poppy seeds according to the Review of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. The invasion of Afghanistan as the U.S. entered as a combatant against the Mujahideen. Donald Rumsfeld, a Secretary of Defense of the Bush campaign, felt that at least the drug fight against Afghanistan, in a sense, was a global terrorism threat, and poppy seed was used as war on drugs rhetoric. The political eradication, though, has been highly disastrous for the government. In reality, its attempt to destroy the crops was a complete failure. There are multiple photos and old videos, for example, one seen on NBC News, showing American soldiers patrolling poppy fields, seemingly ignoring them. There are multiple reports of soldiers destroying these poppy fields. However, they would just dramatically come back, and they continued to do so until the Taliban eventually took control of Afghanistan in 2021. So this 20-year-long war has utterly devastated the region with war, and poppy seed was a valued resource that continued to exist as Afghanistan developed through war.
Afghanistan's history is complicated, with the ruling class and more significant powers in their input on the poppy trade. On one end of their power graph, it started with the irrigation systems called Karez and other bodies of water, which the people depended on due to droughted lands. Karez are really just ancient irrigation systems, all man-made, kind of dug out from the top of a mountain where they just wait for the fresh water to melt off the ice caps. These are horizontal tunnels that seem to be the only actual water source to sustain people and is around 8% of the irrigated land in the country. Besides the Karez that they have, like the Hariru River that produces electricity and fresh water, Karez are more green and energy efficient, using gravity and natural processes to bring fresh meltwater to communities. Additionally, it was found that many families were abandoning land and agriculture due to no water access. According to the Afghan Ministry of Water and Energy, current underground water levels only meet 40% of the city's needs.
That's fascinating.
Crazy to really just depend on that. And then I thought it was interesting because in class, we talked about how bodies of water were granted personhood. And so the Karez have mirabs, which I would equate to a person in charge of those bodies of water granted personhood. Karez is privately owned but shared within the community, and so the mirabs are there to enforce the water rights. But then, after the Taliban took over, they took advantage of these mirabs, and as Karez are quite labor-intensive with maintenance, upkeep, and fragility, they have been using fresh water sources as a power tool to keep the impoverished in check, and their takeover of all these Karez made more farmers turn toward illicit cropping of poppies rather than licit ones due to the poppy's drought-resistant qualities.
Irrigation systems have suffered over the past 3 decades, not only because of lack of investment. Social cohesion and irrigation become more problematic with a country of 2/3 working in agriculture. Sustaining the country during wartime created a vicious cycle. A worse economy caused worse irrigation, leading to an even worse economy, and driving farmers towards poppy cultivation. So with this, we can see that the problem is that there's this continuous cycle of an inability to deal with poppy seeds, constantly influx of local farmers who are trying to sustain themselves during the war. At the same time, the U.S. is providing opportunities of funding of wheat and other crops, but there's still this level of the opium being the mere bedazzling cash crop that could pursue long-term benefits for Afghan farmers.
The only reason why poorer farmers started cultivation was according to the Journal of Illicit Economies. Land-owning households, which did not meet the labor requirements, could offer land on a sharecropping basis to land-poor underemployed males, resulting in land-poor access on which to grow high-value cash crop and food crops and to gauge in the system of advanced purchase on opium. The Taliban themselves also sharecropped their land and shared skills of poppy cultivation to impoverished farmers, starting from the year of the arrival in southern parts of the country. Why hasn't the U.S. targeted the drug warlords? It's because they're the main allies of the International Security Force Alliance. So instead, they focus more on smaller farmers with the ban on poppy cropping, making it more corrupt, because these farmers are more willing to go to the Taliban for help and protection of their poppy crops. In 2018 to 2019, the Taliban generated almost $400 million USD from poppy cultivation and movement of the opium product to fund its activities. So, basically starting from types of Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and World Bank, I would compare them to the Taliban in a way that they're giving out loans to these smaller farmers and the communities to essentially grow poppies, as to gain more tax from them and to move product. But really just any country solely depending on one single sector rather than a few sectors, we face the dependency theory itself, and it makes Afghanistan more vulnerable to the international markets even though it's an illicit crop.
Poppies have helped Afghanistan's growth rate significantly, generating millions in income for the Taliban and controlling powers. However, the distribution of wealth gives farmers a short end of the stick, even though the poppy crop itself can bring them out of debt. It's still part of the drug trade, and demand, depending on price changes as well, keeps producing cycles of debt crises and an surge of poverty and social inequalities. The more restrictive the current controlling group is, the Taliban and the government makes those in the agricultural sector forced to pay more into corruption, just to meet basic needs. While it's kind of like a top-down development, even though it's not the country itself, it's just a farming population which is obviously so large.
The thing about poppy fields is that there's a huge value for everyone, even including women and children. The wage gap difference itself is that an average day laborer can make about $3 per day, but with poppies, they could make up to $7 to $10 a day.
Exactly, which is essential because these average economic opportunities of $3 are intensive work and labor, whether it be construction or something else. UNODC reported in 2019 that 119,000 full-time jobs were available for the local and migrant workers hired by farmers. There was a 50% boost during harvest, and that, $7 to $10 a day money could change the lives of so many people. It's apparent that the poppy inevitably, just through the decades in time, became a part of Afghanistan's social nature. In fact, Christian Predi's SIAS review of international affairs stated, "Poppy is a part of Afghanistan's social nature, oikos." After decades of war and the onset of anthropogenic climate change, poppy cultivation is how Afghan farmers are adapting to the climate crisis. As I mentioned earlier, there's a new loss and damage fund for vulnerable countries hit by climate disasters, and Afghanistan wasn't well represented. The frequency, intensity, and severity of these disasters and natural disasters, whether it be extreme droughts or flash floods, are severe, including global warming. It's drying up the land even more. So we can see that Afghanistan, according to the Informed Risk Index, is ranked 4th on the list of countries most vulnerable and least prepared to adapt to climate change. What's really scary is that 60% of the population is highly dependent on rainfall, but there have been changes in rain and snow patterns which are eroding livelihoods and practices which worsen food security, creating more malnutrition and more disease. In 2008, even the British government reported how problematic climate change would potentially affect Afghanistan. It's been 30 years of worsening climate change, with temperatures increasing and worsening the state of the country, and now they will face their 3rd consecutive year of drought. The OCHA shows the shock affecting the households of Afghanistan is from 39% in 2021 to 64% in 2022. Out of the 25 of 34 provinces experienced severe catastrophic drought, affecting more than 50% of the population. It's creating extreme economic hardship after 4 decades of war.
The annual temperature of the land in Afghanistan has risen from 0.6 Celsius between 1960 and 2008 to 1.2 from 2009 to 2016, exemplifying the amount of snow and glaciers that provide water to rivers during summer. In the OCHA drawings, there's so many incredibly brutal photos of the land with no greenery, just purely dilapidated. My point is that these major swings in extreme weather conditions are avidly at their worst more than ever. Whereas, let's say, Pakistan, the neighboring country of Afghanistan, has had 3 times more usual rainfall in August 2022, making it the wettest since 1961. These atypical rains are actually affecting Afghanistan too, where they've had some heavy rains and then flooding, due to large-scale deforestation in the country, which would have caught and stored the rain. Also, without any proper infrastructure to catch rainwater properly, you're having these extremely severe droughts, where the land is increasingly getting destroyed in most provinces. And then, every once in a while, you have these heavy flash floods also destroying Afghanistan. The Stockholm Environmental Institute showed that Afghanistan's rainfall decreased by 2% per decade.
The Taliban has decided to do something a little bit shocking with poppy seeds. The Taliban created an anti-narcotics unit in the eastern Nangarhar province of Afghanistan. Since then, they've been trying to eradicate poppy farming. The BBC gained access to join them on a patrol of poppy eradication. Less than 2 years ago, the same men who were insurgents fighters who seized control of the country were now, supporting the cultivation of poppy, hence destroying it. In April 2022, the Taliban supreme leader, Habibatullah Akhundzada, decreed that the cultivation of property from which opium, the critical ingredient for the drug heroin, can be extracted is strictly prohibited. Anyone violating the ban would have the field destroyed and penalized, according to Sharia law, as the poppy seed capsules go against religious beliefs. Afghanistan has produced more than 80% of the world's opium, and heroin made from Afghan opium makes up 95% of the market in Europe. Before the Taliban was in control, it was 85 to 90%, and annual cultivation dropped from 80% last year in 2021. What's interesting about this is that the Taliban has carried out the job of removing hundreds of square meters in size, and let's say around 200, 300 square meters of opium in half an hour. Torkan, a leader of a poppy seed removal expedition, reported by BBC, said, "It is the order of our leader. Our allegiance to him is such that if he told my friend to hang me, I would accept it and surrender myself to my friend." There's been hundreds of thousands of hectares being removed, and we've seen in the past how it hasn't worked before.
When the US and Western forces were fighting them, opium poppy became a significant source of income for the Taliban. Now Western forces aren't willing to help. However, they can expect international organizations to support them. But if the Taliban are willing to do such things, they can slash the ban on the removal of opium. However, NGOs and other international organizations have or could be jeopardized if they even work with the Taliban in the first place. So, even just on a reputational issue, banning opium seems to be a problematic idea. We've seen how it hasn't worked previously on a cultural level, and it's needed on an income level. Now, we're in a position where they are doing it, and the Western world is unwilling to help. Opium and heroin prices have remained high. In fact, the nature of the global market of opium hasn't changed for the last 20 years. So when you have billions of dollars of US spending money to eradicate opium in Afghanistan, and the production and trafficking of it to cut Taliban sources, it's ironic that now the Taliban itself, are dropping it. They are banning it themselves for the reason it's been mass consumed heavily in the Western world.
Right, and even with the ban, opium creates so much income for these farmers. It's not like they're just going to stop farming it completely. In some provinces, like Badakhshan province, where the ban was deterred, cultivation actually increased between 2022 and 2023 due to large mass-scale protests from farmers. The ban creates more social inequality between poorer farmers and more wealthier farmers. It widens the gap. Because of higher international prices of opium poppies and product movement, wealthier farmers have more inventory space for poppies than less fortunate farmers, so they can move more product over time as well as store it in times of price increases in the market, while other farmers don't have that luxury. Poorer farming families affected by the ban instead sell off their livestock, have little inventory, lower living standards, and even pull their children out of school. This really shows the ban did nothing except deepen poverty with unchanged levels of opiate exports.
The poppy ban also turns farmers to other types of synthetic drugs to produce, such as methamphetamine, which has increased production alongside the drop in poppy cultivation. Even so, with the decline of opium production, other countries like Myanmar have seen an 18% increase in poppy cultivation since. What really needs to happen is broad-based rural and agricultural development that will benefit affected and impoverished communities. The environmental crises causing Afghanistan to rely on opium poppy cultivation is similar to countries like Argentina, which rely on soy as a cash crop to alleviate debt. While the two are similar in that their environments are their best for their respective crops, soy and poppies, the difference is that the soy cash crop of Argentina is causing its environmental crises, while Afghanistan is showing the aftermath of a country affected by climate change with no turnaround or end in sight to its problems.
Countries like Argentina should use this as a good example to change their policies to protect their land and water bodies better so as not to become reliant on their cash crop, not just for economic reasons, but so they can protect the health of their land. And people before it gets too late and no other agricultural diversification can be made. However, the economy has weakened so much and the ban was so rashly placed that there was no other plan to gain sustainability with horticulture, livestock, and other industry sector growth to replace opium.
The lack of Taliban involvement and their input on aid could turn things around quite well for Afghanistan. Worldwide counter-narcotics meetings, for example, the UN-hosted meetings in Doha, need to keep these facts in mind. And while proposal recommendations and potential financial support to countries like Afghanistan need to understand these new policies cannot feed into quote-unquote unsustainable Taliban approaches. Donations could be made to foster agricultural development. Still, the solution remains open-ended, as the political state and Afghanistan's drought do not make developing a long-term sustainable plan easy. Is a ban the solution, or can other actions be taken? The UNDP has increased private sector development, increasing the number of greenhouses, new irrigation projects, and post-harvest handling facilities. An increase in investment in solar-type irrigation systems without the investment made by opium money could be another solution, with each solar-powered well costing only around $5,000 USD. Still, with declining rainfall patterns and Kharez being dried up, climate change, which is out of the country's hands, needs action to improve. Better protections against deforestation and countermeasures for flash flooding and natural disasters must also be made. While it may be a long and impossible road to a drug-free country, as the region itself faces mass protest, youth addiction, food crises, drought, and poverty. The right outside help from international actors could lead to a small change as long as they are willing and able.
After decades of war and climate change, Afghan farmers have adapted to the climate crisis with the poppy seed. Now removing it or taking it away has failed and continues to make life worse for Afghan farmers and spreads instability. So now that the Taliban is in control, they are replicating the removal of poppies just as the U.S. did. Asim Mayar, a water resource expert and former lecturer at Kabul Polytechnic University, said it's critical to find solutions around the Taliban because the amount of aid given went from $1.26 billion in 2022 to $377 million in 2023 for humanitarian needs alone, with no development projects available. Where will this country go next, and how will the community be affected? With U.S. aid and international organizations unable or unwilling to help, we are left at a constant standby and a worsening, dilapidating country. With Afghanistan not being recognized, Afghan civilians will bear the heaviest cost of climate change, and the impact could be costly across borders. If the Taliban see little help, and if NGOs are unable to provide a more quantifiable form of aid around the Taliban, perhaps there will be a resurgence of poppy. Only time will tell. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.